Hello, how is everybody? Can you hear me okay? Hooray. It feels like a very powerful microphone and a room of friends. So it just means a lot to see humans in this space, which hasn't happened for quite some time. So thanks for being here. Thanks for choosing to come out and hear poems said out loud, especially poems that have traveled long distances to be with us across languages, and as well as prose. So it means a lot. Thank you guys for being here. We tried to do this program in March 2020, which was impossible when we tried to do it before. So you've been waiting a long time for this, me too. And it's a sign, I think, of a kind of right relation with the world that we have poetry readings happening in the Poetry Center again. So you've done well, and I'm glad you're here, and thanks for coming. My name, if I don't know you, my name is Tyler. I work here as the director at the Poetry Center. I'm excited to get to know you. And I want to thank you for helping us get our fall reading series off to a great start. This is the first program. We're learning a lot about our new space. So while the pandemic was happening, we did a lot of improvements in this space. So one of them is a brand new sound system, which hopefully will make things much clearer and easier to hear. We have all new lights. We have new videography equipment, and for the first time, we're able to live stream from this room relatively easily. So all of our fall programs will be live streamed, and if you're watching live online right now, we're glad you're here too. Thanks for coming. I look at you like you're in the ceiling. I guess you're wherever you are, you're over there. Thanks for being here. There's also lots of great improvements that are across the way in the Poetry Center, and so if you haven't had a chance yet to come back to the library, our normal open hours are available from 9 to 5, Tuesday through Friday, and then from 9 to 3 on Saturday. So come see us. We're welcoming individuals in small groups, holding off on large groups right now. So there's a lot of great stuff to see, including some really incredible exhibits and an art installation that's over there that involves finding art objects in the stacks. Which is a great way to remember that all the books are there and they've been waiting for you too, and you can go and visit them while you're discovering art at the same time. Lots of great stuff coming up this fall, and so I just want to quickly mention one thing, which is our next event in our series, which will be October 14th, and that will welcome Luis Alberto Urrea back to Tucson, and he'll be reading in the HSIB building, the Health Sciences Innovation Building, which is not far from here, easy and short walk. And if you happen to catch Carolyn Forcher's reading right before things closed in 2020, it was in that space. So we'll be back over there for Urrea's reading. It's a lovely space that has an indoor-outdoor option as well, just like here at the Poetry Center. And so we'll be having the doors open and welcoming people there to connect with Luis and to hear new work that he'll be bringing to Tucson. This program this evening is a collaboration, which is also a thrill. And so one of our partners is the American Literary Translators Association, which we're so thrilled is housed here in Tucson. And so we're really able to start celebrating that, especially in this moment. And so folks are here from ALTA in a row right here, which is wonderful. Some of our readers, and Sally is here too. So thank you to ALTA for partnering with us, as well as thank you to the College of Humanities for helping support and be a part of this reading this evening. We were to have 10 readers, we're gonna have 8 readers tonight. And so each of the translators, if you wanna read an extra poem or a paragraph, please do so, which would be great. And then broadly, this season at the Poetry Center is a co-sponsorship, and we have support from the Innovations in Healthy Aging Initiative, which is a strategic collaboration between the University of Arizona Health Sciences, and it's a way of rethinking what it means to thrive while aging. So we're really excited for their support, and thank you for that support at the reading series. And with that, I'm gonna welcome up translators, and we'll just come up one by one. Our first translator is gonna be Beppe Cavatorta. I'm gonna read a little bit, and I'm gonna do my best to pronounce things that I have no business pronouncing. So Beppe will correct it when he comes up here, which would be great. If you don't know Beppe, he's a professor of Italian here at the U of A, and the editor of several books and anthologies, including The Promised Land, A Spatola, The Position of Things, Collected Poems 1961 to 1992, Balleriniana, Luigi Ballerini, Poesie, 1972 to 2015, and Deconstructing the Model in 20th and 21st Century Italian Experimental Writing. He's also the author of Scrivere Contro, in which he recreated a profile of experimental writing in Italy from the beginning of the 20th century to the late 1960s, and highlighted works that have been categorized under spurious and often conflicting ideological headings. I love that. I'm excited to talk more about that. An incredible range of work across all of Beppe's offerings, and perhaps what I find most fascinating is this massive tome that he's been working on, as well as working on the sequel to. And so he's the co-editor of Those Who From Afar Look Like Flies, an anthology of Italian poetry from Officina to the present that weighs in at 2,100 pages. It's a beautiful book that's big. A second volume is almost done, which we were talking about. It just needs mostly an introduction and some reviews. So please welcome Beppe Cavatorta.
Well, thank you, Tyler, for the very generous introduction. And thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you for having invited me here. I was asked to say a little bit about the work I do besides doing the reading. So, I mean, this is the volume we were talking about, and this is a project that began in 2001, and the first volume came out in 2017. There are more than, the total project will cover more than 135 Italian poets, and there are more than 150 translators that collaborated to this work. And very proud of this. And tonight I would like to present some poems that I actually have translated, that I have co-authored with some of my undergraduate students. We, do this work in class, and when there is an exceptional student, often I ask them if they would like to publish something with me. We start working together besides the class, and then it has already happened 3 times that we had the poems published in this beautiful journal. That is the Journal of Italian Translation that comes out 4 times every year. It is, a very voluminous volume, and it is a huge help for Italian translator in the United States. Luigi Bonafini is the editor. Okay, now I'll go reading. I will begin with Sergio Azzeni, that is a Sardinian poet. And maybe what is most interesting about him is that his poems are, in his poems, he used some of the Sardinian language that unfortunately in translation will be lost, but he remains, I don't know, to me a very interesting poet and funny as well. I hope it will show. As everyone knows, Otis is a pianist and a singer, and also, for a living, a salesman of diapers for the elderly, Romanian watches and teapots. Sad is the life of the poet. Otis is a poet, no doubt about it. Here is why. If you met him and you said good morning, he would reply, sea and mountains, or city and basement, depending on whether he liked you or not on that day. He wrote and performed a song called Benzoin. The lyrics go, I burn like a wick, baby, I'm all benzoin. He is particularly proud of the equivocal use of the term benzoin. He invented the word varzia, now widely used, but before Otis unknown. Its meaning is now famous. Complicated intrigue, mess, mix, paranoia, vicious circle, lawyer's tricks, brown nosing, poisons for friends, backstabbing, IRS, and taxes. If the Varzia is dark, every man is for himself. What can you ask the poet more than to bring together man's old suffering and the impotence of our time in one and wonderful word. Besides the honesty to say what he thinks of you, starting with his greetings. Besides the mad use of the dictionary, what can you ask the poet? Roses and cinnamon? Machine guns and knives? Songs of freedom? Of sorrow? Please, praise Otis and his vein. Second one. Life is a war for gangs. No news there, and nothing wrong with it. It becomes a condemnation if they forbid you to make, for love and worship of the leaders, a solitary war, to be a one-man gang. And now the last one. Jesuino Moreno's pub, a dump at the docks, here in town, Illinois pub. Once I asked Jesuino Moreno why he called that place Illinois and why pub and not cantina or birreria. I have always wondered one thing, he responded. Why do you bust everybody's ball with all these questions? That makes no sense. This is the age of English. I do not like cantina. It gives an idea of darkness. I like the name Illinois, and I like horses. Illinois is the land of horses, horseland. There you have it. Next year, I'll go with Horseland Pub. What do you think I should call it? The crazy dude's house? From that day, he stopped speaking to me. This was Sergio Azzeni. And the other one that I would like to give you a taste is a long poem by Emilio Zucchi, that is a poem from Parma. And this is, it is of a completely different nature, since it is the revisitation of the life of one of the most infamous fascists during World War II, an infamous torturer, and his encounter with a female partisan, Anna Maria Enriquez, that would be killed by him. And it's a very long poem, it's 33 stanzas. I will give you just a little idea. Expose electric cables on the bare ankles of the female partisans at Villa Triste. Bronze Arno, you feel the silence solidify the pierced scream of Anna Maria Enriquez. Soon your shore, wash out with sand, will have the spasm of bodies riddled with holes, chosen to come out of life. Arno, cold with sorrow, the walls do not see you, the window shutters are closed, eyelids of fog touch Ponte Vecchio, dogs run. A fragrant silk scarf, a gold lighter, polished shoes. The gramophone of the torturer tickles white arms. Pietro Koch watches the glass amber with cognac, while below they burn the armpits of the ones tied to chairs. 3 aren't enough to restrain the victim. The screams are nostrils of sweaty horses just before the firing of the starting pistols. He had arrived from Rome, and after the 8th of September, he had chosen to fight on the side of the trains that swallow up Jewish children to vomit them into Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau. Pietro Koch had been perfect in succeeding to give life to the Special Police Division. One excellent arrest in a secure place. Caracciolo, a general faithful to the oath to the king, had hidden himself in the convent, brotherly with shadows, of Saint Sebastian. Koch had learned this and reported it to Tamburini, head of the police. Sacred place, you could violate it, not us. Koch, smiling, asked and obtained a squad, causing a great stir. Caracciolo was taken. Tamburini was thrilled. Here was the right man for the dirtiest tasks. Here was the executor. See, Beppe, don't do this. Just one last stanza. Okay, maybe not. Here it is. This is the introduction on Ana Maria Enriquez. With a degree in medieval history, Ana Maria was 37 the day she was handcuffed. Daughter of a Jewish father and a Catholic mother, she was born in Bologna. She had lived in Naples, Sassari, and then Florence, always according to her father's academic assignments. She was employed at the National Archives in Florence when the fascist cancer began to metastasize in her blue dress with white flowers. When the metastasis spread to her hair, gathered with modesty on her neck, and to her meek eyes, the metastasis of the racial laws. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. I realized that there was a critical detail that I left out in the beginning, and Beppe talking about the anthology that he's working on reminded me that it's sort of a veritable ALTA conference unto itself. And of course, what I need to tell you is that the ALTA conference is happening soon in Tucson and online. So in this most special of years, you get both options. And so coming up soon in October, the virtual version of the conference will be taking place. And that will happen the 15th to the 17th in October. And then the in-person version will happen here in November, the 11th to the 13th. I've got that right. Yes? Good. Okay. So if you're so moved by all the great things you're going to hear tonight that we've already started hearing, you can get a great fix by joining the conference and the attendings that are happening there. There's a lot of great translation that's coming up this fall. So be very excited about it, including from our next reader, who's Todd Fredson, who has the distinction of being the second most traveled person to be here tonight. And I'm really grateful to him for driving down from points north to join us in Tucson and share some of his work, which is wonderful. He's the author of several books of poetry and poetry in translation and of literary criticism and scholarship, especially on West African poetics. And his translations of the Ivorian poet Tanella Boni's collection, The Future Has an Appointment with the Dawn, was a finalist for the 2019 Best Translated Book Award in Poetry and the 2019 National Translation Award. His translation of Boni's collection, There Where It's So Bright in Me, will be out in fall of 2022. And his translations of the Beppe poet Azo Vague's book-length poems, Zakwato and Long Le Du Peril, are forthcoming as a double translation in spring 2023. From Action Books. He's been supported by Fulbrights and NEA fellowships. Please help me welcome Todd Fredson.
So I feel like stage fright. It's just amazing to be in front of people here, which I hadn't really thought about until Kelsi pointed out that you are not, in fact, behind a screen at all. So yeah, as Tyler pointed out, I've worked with an Ivorian poet, Tanella Boni, from West Africa. And so I'm going to read a set of poems from her 2018 collection, Là où il fait si clair en moi, which I've translated as There Where It's So Bright in Me. And it was the 2018 Prix Théophile Gautier awardee from the French Academy. And I'm really excited that it's going to be in the world next year. So preview of it, she's sort of self-exiled to France during the first Ivorian Civil War, 2002 to 2007, and returned after the second Civil War, which is 2010, 2011. And she still splits her time between France and Cote d'Ivoire. So she's had this experience of being a migrant in Europe and in France during a lot of the aggressive anti-migrant nationalism. And then she's back in Cote d'Ivoire where she has the experience of living in the violent expansion of Al-Qaeda's Maghreb faction in the Islamic State in West Africa. And then she is abroad in the US where she confronts the sort of racialized violence that accompanies the idea of blackness here, arriving from West Africa where she says it's a place that doesn't really feel that idea's weight. So the book sort of pries at the complexities of difference, race, religion, gender, nationality that are sort of shaping our 21st century geopolitics. It's arranged in 7 sections. None of the poems have titles. And so I'm just going to kind of read across the collection here, 7 poems. The first 2 are from the first section, which is Words Are My Preferred Weapon. Every departure is also a return. You leave with your dreams, you leave with life, your memories. Like the slow-footed camel, you carry your baggage on your back, at the end of your arms, from stop to stop, until the return, your first departure into foreign countries. You walk down the lanes of your city, where the trees of splendorous dreams that shelter against the weather are rare now. In these foggy conditions, the leaves are umbrella covers. Your heart may live in the dry grass of this turmoil, your heart that can barely accept that a path home is opened, charcoal still embers in your clenched chest, guarded by the immense silence of what is now unspoken in peacetime. The fire that scorches your gaze, seizes your throat each time you approach the front step, and the harmattan blows like a bad memory across these coals through the fragile ashes, although the fault isn't in the weather. Blame the humans who think they are right on a course of action, who will not deviate 1 iota. This is a poem from the section, The Path of Ephemeral Lives. Who could appreciate the intensity of my voice? Me who has watched emerge a generation of ephemeral lives, born under the colored sign, undesirable, humans in their insecure and conspicuous lives. Humans who live with peace in the soul, without hate, without grudges, seeing straight through until the horizon destroyer crushes their big plans. Humans who hustle on the streets, the place reserved just for them. It's a story of here and elsewhere, a story noticeably written on the foreheads of travelers crossing borders, even those on the right side of the law. And the next 2 are from a section called Memory of a Woman. I faced the depths of the abyss when the holds of the slave ships have disappeared from my sight. I went north to south, east to west. The cardinal points admired the lightness of my steps, but I haven't found my country. Where had I intended to aim my boat? Now I know where I come from, unsure of which sea I sailed. I don't move from my home. I've carried forward in my head my memory of beautiful days, my woman's memory, which saw everything, heard everything. Here I am at the day's longest door, there where it is so bright in me. My reason refuses the blunt secular clarity that separates humanity into unequal portions, humans so divided, so mistreated, and looked through. The selfhood that I've inherited, invisible because of my skin, which makes me so visible. The skin that has given me everything, the skin of which I'm so proud, my woman's skin that makes its own rules, rules that are only a tiny part of me. And then these last 2 poems are from a section, What Needs to Be Said. I've walked through the world in a dream. I didn't want to know it. I forbade myself from seeing the actual state of it. My self-righteous speeches ended once I stumbled into this corner of the day, where the day in fact rises and the sun shines on the sufferings that do not fade, the injuries, the abuse, the failures slow to scar over, the slight truth of difference, since it must be named, pokes into our guts with its tentacles, slowly, relentlessly, until breathing is cut off. To breathe, there is only this one sacred verb that sings with the sense of life. Those who no longer breathe are countless, and every murdered name rumbles, thundering with media amplification as the actual memories flake away. My skin has become transparent. It's undoubtedly been that way since the beginning. I forgot to open my eyes where I was, a place that doesn't really feel the idea's weight. My neighborhood stops stormed, my speech snuffed out, my words refused, swept under the carpet. When my boat navigates from one sea to the other, and my skin is soaked with the mood of the world, I find that the world prefers me, confined to my country. Thanks.
Our next reader is Faith Harden, who's an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese here at the University of Arizona. She's recently published her first book, Arms and Letters, Military Life Writing in Early Modern Spain. The book explores gendered representations of honor, violence, and literary self-fashioning in 16th and 17th century soldiers' memoirs. She's currently at work on 3 projects: a monographic volume for eHumanista on military lives in the medieval and early modern Iberian world, a translation of the picaresque novel Estebiano Gonzalez, and a monograph on the literary and cultural significance of animal imagery in peninsular and colonial Spanish texts. Please help welcome Faith Harden to come read.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah? Okay. So after those, okay, better? All right, thank you. So after those beautiful poems by Todd and Beppe, I'm going to be a little bit of a comic prosaic interlude from the 17th century. So what I'm going to do is just share a brief selection from my current translation project, which is actually the first English translation of Estebiano Gonzalez. And the full title of the novel is The Life and Works of Estebiano Gonzalez, a Man of Good Humor, composed by the author himself. So as the title kind of signals, the novel is cleverly disguised as an autobiography of a buffoon, so a man of good humor, right? It's a picaresque narrative, so in other words, it's a first-person account of a low-class anti-hero who kind of has to make his way in the world using the only resources at his disposition, which are his wit and his ability to entertain and deceive. Right? So the novel was first published in Spanish in Antwerp, it's kind of the seat of the Spanish Netherlands, in 1646. And by all accounts, it was both a literary and commercial success. There were several subsequent printings. There was a loose translation into French. And although an adaptation into English was published in the early 18th century, there's never yet been a true attempt at translation. Right? So why not? You know, given that this was one of the most widely read examples of the picaresque in the 17th century, and given that it had kind of a measurable impact on the way that subsequent novels were marketed in Spain, including Don Quixote, like why has nobody tried to translate this? I asked myself. So there are 2 kind of intertwined difficulties with translating, you know, any historical text, but particularly this one. So on the one hand, there's just kind of the technical problem of language, right? Like how do you render into another language, kind of the wordplay, the neologisms, the arcane sort of diplomatic and courtly, argot of this time, right? And then on the other hand, there's kind of the related, broader issue of humor. Like how do you, sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. How do you render situational humor, wordplay, and then more troublingly, how do you deal, how do I deal, how does Wen deal with the issue of kind of contextualizing and explaining episodes that were perceived as humorous in the 17th century, but that now are very rightly recognized as enacting symbolic violence, right? So I'm still grappling with this kind of problem, so I'll leave that for another venue, and I'll keep it light, right? And I'll just give you a couple examples of the sort of wordplay and kind of social humorous situations that I've sort of worked on so far. So here's an example of some wordplay. In the following selection from his prefatory prologue to the reader, Estebanillo plays with the trope, dear reader, right? So dear obviously can mean esteemed or admired or expensive, right? So he writes, dear or discount reader, or whoever you are, if you're curious to learn about the lives of others and you find yourself reading mine, you should know this. I am Estebiano Gonzalez, an unrivaled ruffian, the best of the worst. And I warn you that this is not the phony story of Guzman de Alfarache, nor the fictitious tale of Lazarillo de Tormes, nor the supposed story of the Knight of the Pinchers, but a true, verified, certified, validated, and corroborated report of my deeds and doings. So that selection kind of makes use of legal formulas that were sort of meant to indicate sworn testimony, as the narrator lists all of his picaresque predecessors that his tale supposedly surpasses in truth. Of course, ironically, all that does is inscribe his text within that imaginative literary tradition. So Estebanillo's insistence on the veracity of his account rests pretty uneasily next to the brazenness with which he highlights his own gluttony and cowardice. So food and Estebanillo's insatiable desire for eating are key elements of these humorous episodes. So in the following passage, Estebanillo is traveling with his master, General Ottavio Piccolomini, who's a real historical figure. And rather than cook a meal for his master himself, he goes down to the kitchen to try to trick the head chef into concocting this ridiculously complicated, kind of ad-libbed early modern turducken, right? So seriously, so that he, Estebanillo, can laze around in the kitchen and just drink wine. Right? So he explains the recipe. He says, now this egg goes inside the pigeon in the partridge in a chick, the chick in a capon, the capon inside a pheasant inside a turkey, the turkey in a goat, the goat in a sheep, the sheep in a suckling calf, and the suckling calf inside a cow. All this must be washed, plucked, skinned, and larded, except for the cow who keeps her hide. And afterwards, once you take it from the fire, it will be transformed into such delicious and exquisite fare that you will understand why the emperors in olden times used to eat it on their coronation day. What's it called? Because the egg is the keystone of this edible edifice. The traditional name is imperial stuffing, extravaganza. So sorry, such a dad joke. So the chef is horrified and confused, and he goes off to make the dish. So Estebanillo does have plenty of time to drink wine. So at times, Estebanillo's gluttony and cowardice are combined in a single episode. In this selection, Estebanillo tells of his quote-unquote war experience as a servant to General Piccolomini. His service mainly consists of hiding and hanging back to eat up the camp's supplies. So in a satirical send-up of the kinds of military campaign diaries that were being actually written and circulated by many of his contemporaries, Estebanillo writes, we captured a few villages whose names I never learned because I never saw them. I had no desire to risk my own good health and comfortable life. Instead, while the soldiers began to besiege the plazas, I was besieged by hunger. I scraped the bottom of the stew pot to the beat of their marching drums. When they overran the town's defenses, I scaled our rotisseries and seized upon each delectable morsel of meat. So even as Estebiano boasts in his prologue that soldiers in particular will find his battle scenes particularly thrilling, he openly embraces this kind of dishonor when he recounts scenes of cowardice and even desertion. So I'll leave you with this one last episode. He's accompanying General Piccolomini to the field where the Battle of Nordlingen was fought. And it's a battle which the general famously distinguished himself. But Estebiano is spooked by a burst of cannon fire, and he runs straight back to his headquarters. He says, "At that moment, the town fired upon us with a cannon blast that, had it been better aimed, would have blown us to bits. At first, I showed no weakness, because my master was there with me. But when I saw that just a little ahead of us, a soldier was thrown into the air like a carnival acrobat, well, I acted in accord with my buffoonish profession, preferring that they say of me, 'Here he fled,' rather than 'Here he lay dead.' And so away I sped with all the grace of a winged horse. When he's finally confronted by his master, who pulls him out of the haystack, the general demands to know, 'Picaro, scoundrel, are you such a coward that you've left me in sight of the whole army, turning your back and running away?' I replied, 'Sir, who told your excellency that I'm valiant? What have I not done worse than today? If you sent me to Flanders to serve as a soldier, you've been misinformed about my character, because just as there are archpriests of priests, I am the arch-chicken of chickens.'" So the episode ends there with the enraged general kind of dissolving into laughter at the apparent simplicity of his servant, right? Who's able to transmute his reprehensible behavior into at least a source of hilarity. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
I may need to rename my son. It seems like he does all those things. Our next reader is Cynthia Hough, who has published 9 poetry collections, including Revenants and In June, The Labyrinth. Her 10th collection, Instead It Is Dark, is forthcoming from Red Hen Press. She's co-translated 3 books of translation, the first of which, Fortino Samano, won the Landon Translation Award from the Academy of American Poets. Her 3rd volume, Distantly from the Quebecois French of Nicole Brossard, will be out from Omnidon in 2022, along with a chapbook of ekphrastic poems written during the pandemic, Contain. Her critical work includes the co-edited first edition of HD's The Sword Went Out to Sea. Among Hough's honors are Fulbright and NEA fellowships. She is the inaugural Marshall Chair in Poetry Emerita Professor of English at Arizona State University. She travels to France, but we're very lucky that she chooses to make Tucson home. Welcome back to Tucson. Thanks for coming to read.
Thanks for this invitation. It's wonderful to be here and very exciting that ALTA has its base at the university. It's also humbling to hear some of these wonderful translations. I am going to share just one of the poems from Jeanne d'Arc. That's our 2nd book. To give you a little bit of background, it's written by Natalie Cont, and she is a performance poet, avant-garde. She is 3rd generation Pied Noir. So her grandfather, her family were French speaking in Algeria and were evicted when Algeria became liberated from France. So Joan of Arc actually is about a woman who is fighting colonization. We never think of that really, but she is at a time when France is nation building and England is trying to occupy part of France. Quintin's portrait of Joan of Arc is often irreverent, quirky, feminist, and we never think of some of the questions that she raises. How in the world did a shepherdess learn to ride a horse? How did it occur to her to lead an army, to break a siege. And how did she reach the Dauphin? How did she become Joan of Arc? So I'll read this one piece where she is finding her name. To go from the uncertain names of Tark, Dare, of a girl who might have remained nameless, who would have been the shepherdess, the daughter of her father, a Domremian, a partisan, to the immunized dark, Joan. You learned to acknowledge the dark as dark. Dark, 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 dark to duplicate. Finally, as sobriquet, the one you dreamed of, angel benefactor, exterminator, blonde guardian, gay and patient provider, aid to salvation, soldier lily, loyal standard, unfailing adjuvant, linear and wise flower, eye and ear, altar of clairvoyance, kind enterprise, prudent victory, image, creatrix of evidence, gleaming blade, scourge of God. And just to give you a flavor of that book, then I'll move on to I say our, and I want to give due credit to my co-translator, the French economist and political scientist, Sylvain Gallet, who never in a million years imagined that he would retire to translate avant-garde French poetry with his second wife. Quand même, chérie, n'est-ce pas? Lointaine by Nicole Brossard is also feminist, but very obliquely. It is also queer and experimental, highly lyrical, and the poems are linked through the trope of urban life, very postmodern urban life. Cities with their fools for God. This time I count the hands, the feet, the tongues, the tunics, the pebbles, the heads, the beards, the skull caps, the veils, the scarves. I do not count the vertigos, the ablutions, the miracles, the whiplashes. In the loudspeakers, the dozens of spat out words, such a big fire that water must be splashed on brow, on feet. I count the eyes, the fingers. I count until dust. I count until childhood. Cities really. When the cold carves in the trees small agglomerations of meaning, if you learn how to touch someone's shoulder easily, to change the future, touch. Cities with a face. Because it's better to sigh beyond beliefs and further still the solitude. Here you spread arms wide before you, like someone who wants the whole sea to herself. Its infallible light of passion. Cities without names. Cities when someone shoves you, says sorry, sorrow, because of the din and the rain, wraps arms around a melody to lift up the present, the strong perfume of change which fascinates you every morning. Anyway, you love humanity with helpless arms, without oxygen in the middle of its gleaming debris. cities where my face returns, cities with hope in the crosshairs of sobs. Do we think that dawn is a word? Or have we said by accident, tengo sueño? This very morning, in a city in America, to smile sap beyond all schedules, I breathe slowly, a life of frescoed words, women wrapped in the joy of wandering and infinity. Thank you.
Great. Our next reader is Elisabeth Jacquette, a translator from Arabic. Most recently, her translation of Minor Detail from Anya Shibley was a finalist for the 2020 National Book Award and longlisted for the 2021 International Booker Prize. She is the executive director of ALTA, and it is a thrill that she lives in Tucson. Please welcome Elisabeth Jacquette.
I would say the real thrill is that ALTA is here in Tucson and that we are all here together. It's as Tyler mentioned, we've been planning and dreaming about this reading for a very long time, and I feel like it's a joy to be starting to hold events like this in person, presaging obviously our conference and many future collaborations with the Poetry Center. So thank you. Can you guys hear me? Okay, great. I'm going to be reading 2 sections from Minor Detail by Anya Shibley. This is prose. I gotta break it to you. Sorry, audience. This is a novella that takes place in Palestine in 2 parts, 2 halves that don't fit exactly neatly together. The first chronicles a platoon of Israeli soldiers who, in 1949, 1 year after the Nakba, commit a terrible crime. And the second part takes place over half a century later, where a young woman discovers mention of this crime in passing and becomes obsessed and feels this eerie connection to the victim of the crime and goes off kind of as an amateur sleuth in search of the victim's side of the story, which is somewhat of a fruitless quest, all the while asking herself why she's drawn to this minor detail in history when there are so many other atrocities happening all around. As a translator, it was a challenging book for many reasons. One, the author, in passing on our first conversation about the book, she said, oh yeah, it's, the first part and the second part, they're completely separate, 2 different narrators, 2 different parts, over 50 years separate them, but they're exactly the same length to the word, which was daunting until I realized it actually wasn't true, which gave me some freedom to not have to be the same length in English. But the 2 perspectives, the 2 narrators are very different in terms of voice. I'm going to read a section from each. But what stitches them together are these echoes, as the author calls them, between the 2 sections, these recurring images, sounds, words that give, I think, the reader the sense at the end that history isn't something that remains in the past. So without further ado, this comes from part 1, which is narrated by the officer in that platoon. They were the first and only platoon to arrive this far south since the armistice had been declared, and they had been given complete responsibility for maintaining security in the area. On the way to his hut, he passed the command tent where his deputy, the division sergeants, and the driver were resting after their afternoon patrol, and he informed them that they would be conducting another patrol before sunset. Then another patrol, and another the next day, and the day after that, yet all the area revealed were sandstorms and dust clouds, which seemed intent on chasing and harrying them. These storms did not succeed in stopping their patrols, nor did the stillness of the barren hills weaken his resolve to find any remaining Arabs in the area and capture the infiltrators among them, who rushed to hide behind the dunes when they heard the vehicles roar. Their slender black shadows sometimes wavered in front of him, trembling between the hills, but whenever the vehicle raced toward them and arrived, they found no one. Only the intense heat or darkness could put an end to these pursuits. Only when they could no longer bear the blazing sun or when night began to fall would he tell the driver to return them to camp. And with nightfall, the air grew less heavy and dense, while retaining a tolerable degree of heat. It's relatable. This enlivened the soldiers, most of whom, since their arrival, had not left the camp or even the strips of shade by the tents where they sought refuge each day when they'd finished their drills. And so, in the evening, the sound of their conversations and laughter rumbled through the area until 10 p.m., when they retired to their tents and he went to his hut. Inside, the darkness was thick and strong. From time to time, noises would seep into the space, at first sounding like murmurs and snippets of unintelligible clamor, until it gradually became possible to distinguish the sound of wind slapping the tent roofs, the footfalls of soldiers patrolling the camp, and their abrupt calls, all of which were interspersed with distant sounds of gunshots, dogs barking, and maybe camels groaning. It was approaching midnight, August 11th, 1949. He slowly drew his hand to the edge of the table, bent his knees, and began to stand up, but he staggered and quickly gripped the chair, supporting his body with both hands. He took a deep breath. On his second attempt, he managed to stand, then walked over to the trunk in the corner of the room, bent over it, placed his hands on the locks, opened them, and lifted the lid. He reached inside with his right hand and took out some box magazines. He stood up again, went back to the table, set down the magazines, and then, with trembling hands, began carefully placing them in his pouch as sweat dripped from his hairline down his temples and cheeks. When he had finished, he picked up his gun from where it was leaning against the table, slung it over his shoulder, and left the hut. The darkness outside seemed less intense, although the full moon was now 2 nights past. He paused for a moment at the entrance gate, waiting for the soldiers on guard to open it, then set off west toward the jet-black hills which gently swallowed him whole. So that's from part 1, and then half a century later, we have our second narrator. After I'd finished hanging the curtains over the windows, I lay down on the bed. At that moment, a dog on the opposite hill began to howl incessantly. It was past midnight, and I couldn't sleep, despite how thoroughly exhausted I was. I had spent the whole day arranging and cleaning the house. I dusted the furniture, swept the floor, and rewashed the bed sheets and towels and most of the dishes, even though, in principle, the house was clean before I began cleaning it so thoroughly. The landlord told me he'd brought in a woman especially for that. I'd started renting this house a few days earlier, right after getting my new job. On the whole, the house is good, and the job is good, and my colleagues are nice. But none of this was enough to help me overcome the anxiety and fear that the dog's endless howling awakened me that night. Not even a little. Regardless, I realized that when I woke up the next morning, I'd feel an overwhelming sense of satisfaction, its main source being the cleanliness of the house, and perhaps the curtains hung over its windows. I had placed my table by the biggest window, where I would sit every morning and drink my coffee before going to my new job, and the neighbors and their 3 children would pass by and wave to me, all of which would imply that I lived a peaceful life overlooking a back garden hidden from view. I have an inability to identify borders, even very rational borders, which makes me overreact sometimes or underreact at other times, unlike most people. For instance, when a military patrol stops the minibus I take to my new job, the first thing that appears through the door is the barrel of the gun, I ask the soldier, while stuttering, most likely out of fear, to put it away when he's talking to me or asking to see my identity card. At which point, the soldier starts mocking my stutter, and the passengers around me grumble because I'm overreacting. There's no need to make things so tense. The soldier isn't going to shoot at us, and even if he does, my intervention won't change the course of things, quite the opposite. Yes, I realize all that, just not in the moment, but rather hours or days or even years later. That's one example. But since I lack the ability to evaluate things rationally, situations like this have a severe impact on me. They shake and destabilize me to the point that I can no longer fathom what is permissible and what is not, and I end up trespassing even more borders, worse ones than before. And all my fear and anxiety and internal turmoil dissipates when this trespassing occurs within the confines of my solitude. Solitude is so forgiving of trespassed borders. It was only thanks to my time spent alone, sitting at that table in the morning, working on something, that I was able to make my discovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Lissy. Our next reader is Farid Matuk, the author of the poetry collections This is a Nice Neighborhood and The Real Horse. And he's working now on translations from the poet Juan Felipe Herrera, which I'm excited to hear more about. His work has been anthologized in the Best American Experimental Poetry and in Angels of the Americlips, an anthology of new Latinx writing, among other places. His work has been supported by residencies and grants from the Headland Center for the Arts and the Lanham Foundation and the Visiting Holloway Professorship in Poetry and Poetics at UC Berkeley. He's an associate professor of English here at the University of Arizona and helps support and teaches in the creative writing program. Please help welcome Farid Matuk.
Thank you, everybody. So it's a special night, like for me, like for so many of us, it's a first reading in person in a while. But it's also special for me because I get to meet Beppe for the first time, who is the first person translating my own work to another language that I'm aware of. So that's very special. Right, so long before Juan Felipe Herrera was the first Latinx poet laureate of the United States, he was a young man leaving Southern California to start graduate work at Stanford in 1977. He meets Francisco Alarcón, who becomes a co-conspirator, connects him to a thriving Chicano-Chicanx theater, poetry, and cultural scene in the Bay Area. And he starts writing these wild poems that range across all kinds of forms and genres. Writes them in Spanish, writes them for about 10 years and hands them to a set of friends to translate into English. They're published in 1989 by a small press named Alcatraz Editions, and the book is quickly forgotten. In an interview included in this new edition that we're doing, he says it was a singular book that really can't be connected too much to any other book in his trajectory. He goes on to have a fabulous career, culminating in the laureateship. And so now, all of these years later, there's this opportunity to relaunch the book. In the intervening years, or in the last, I'm looking at you, Sarah, to tell me, 10 years, handful of years, this amazing press, Noemi Press, has come onto the landscape in US poetry. And one of their series is named Acrylica after this book, and it's responsible for launching the careers of many innovative Latinx poets, and I think really becoming a significant and dependable contributor to kind of the US conversation in poetry. And so the editor of that press, the founder of that press, Carmen Jimenez-Smith, who had been running the series named after this book for so long, really wanted to honor the source of that series and relaunch Juan Felipe's Acrylica. So Juan Felipe entrusts a new group of translators to redo the entire book. They are Hanta Samsa, Susie Garcia, J. Michael Martinez, Rosa Alcala, Anthony Cody, Carmen Jimenez-Smith, and myself. The book launches in January of next year, so I hope you'll look for it. I'll read 3 pieces. The first is Quintino's Diary Fragments, and this is one that I translated. Tuesday, January 1979. I write my cousin a few lines, greetings, memories, hugs, periods, words. I can't ignore the route the letter takes. Towards San Quentin, north of San Francisco. I read the newspaper. Somoza's blood campaign in Nicaragua carries on. I'm sure the FSLN will defeat the Somocista throne. Only one question remains: how to undo Somoza's mind. In Latin America, the difference between the consequences of the oppressor's ideology and the results of a revolution for liberation is clear. It shines in the pupils of the peasant worker, and it becomes a dark knot of struggle. In the United States, the boss's rage sings on, Channel 7. It is illustrated on the covers of records and video cassettes. It is projected in slow motion against the scape of a throbbing belly on the screen of our favorite cinema. We're drawn in by its manly musk. It does not confess in the state-sponsored churches. It greets us in university hallways. It gives us food stamps, hugs us. It serves us up a glass of icy smirks. It undoes our dress. It caresses us surreptitiously. We surrender, and at sunset, we begin to build our very own cells. Some of us, it cannot be denied, volunteer, become guards. To expect anything more would be disgraceful, although I do not doubt that some factions feel entitled to reimbursement for their hours of state service. The letter will arrive to San Quentin on Friday. My cousin will read it. We will both realize that the bars dividing our worlds are imagined, that the free aren't free, the prisoners are truly prisoners. Monday, April 1979. Some months will pass. He'll hear his father's health is declining. We will see each other for the first time in 18 years in a yellowish room outside the emergency room at a San Francisco County hospital. I will keep an eye on the officer guarding my cousin beside his elderly his father with plastic tubes up his nose. Months will pass. We will hear the news that Somoza is fleeing Nicaragua. Families, women, men, the FSLN will triumph. Sunday, September 1980. In a room in San Jose, my cousin opens the doors, glimpses the avenues hard, hot, walks. Somoza will be assassinated in Paraguay. The engine of his Mercedes will keep spinning after its body explodes. Wednesday, December 1983. In these wide streets, in the parks, the chic boutiques, in the quiet apartments of gated communities, the guards keep guarding. The prisoners remain imprisoned. No one can hear shackles break. Two more short poems. These two are translated by the poet Rosa Alcala. The Bee's Fury. When the building's shoulders burned, when women's breasts engendered horses, when the boy listened with the blades of his eyes, when the elderly arm emptied rifles into hospitals, when the judge's voice turned black salamander, when the guards vomited bird drag, when the wind hammered the convent with gangrene, when Emilio, sightless, traced the sun between the graves, when the salt mine pooled at the tips of our veins, when wailing's lash became a woman in your throat. And the last piece is Le Destin du Vide. In the territory of your hands, a fire. In the belly of your house, a magnet. On the branch of your blood, a bird. In the arc of your brow, a voice. Soars over the beach and descending through diamantine space, paints the tribe's shoulders, the rituals for a girl left in the forest to become a woman, with your skin tightened by night's fury and by anguish, with your arms in the shadows, the infinite fronds, the smoke and the moon, the wounds and the light. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Our penultimate reader is Kelsi Vanada, who holds an MFA in poetry from the Iowa Writers Workshop and an MFA in literary translation from the University of Iowa. Her translations include Sergio Espinosa's Into Muteness and Berta Garcia Fayette's The Eligible Age. And she's the author of the poetry chapbook Rare Earth. Kelsi is the program manager for ALTA and also makes her home here in Tucson. Welcome, Kelsi.
you, Tyler. Thank you, Poetry Center. Thank you all for your presence and your work. Alvaro Lasso is a Peruvian poet. I feel like translators always like to show off the book. Haven't figured out why that is, but here's the book. Alvaro Lasso is a Peruvian poet, and his poems in this book, Izquierda Unida, explore the successes and the failures of the coalition Izquierda Unida, or United Left, an alliance of leftist political parties in Peru founded in 1980. As Lasso explains in an interview in my translation, Izquierda Unida is ultimately the story of a country and its violent transformations, the story of the war that forced its way into our teenage years or our childhoods, and how that war has configured the collective imaginations of the adults we are now. It's the story of those of us who write that history, but we're neither the winners nor the losers. Lasso is also a publisher, and many of the pieces in this book have to do with the role of artists and the political nature of publishing. His prose poems are often sarcastic, cinematic, sometimes violent, self-referential, strange and surreal, and I hope you enjoy them, but also that you feel the power of their critique. And I'm excited to share that my translation of this book will be published by the new press, Eulalia Books, next year. So this is called Alto Peru. For a time, the party was a movement that believed in violence. Everyone at school spoke of taking up arms, of finding surrealist poets to assassinate in the jungle. The slogan was, "Stay aware in the face of the drug companies." So they got dressed, grabbed speakers, and marched off to the labyrinth with heads held high. When they arrived, they found no human beings. Their weapons were melting away. They got diarrhea, started to crawl around. As if they'd been tricked, they cried till they lost all speech. And the mothers of the combatants helicoptered in, annoyed, with fly swatters. They called roll and, undeterred, took them home. Nobility. When it comes to decapitations, I just have to say one thing. It's tough to learn to perfect a smile for the executioner. The executioner's nobility, like a beauty pageant, has been forged by long tradition. Also present is the public. They haven't paid admission. They've endorsed justice without understanding it. They listen to the leader's voice without any sign of approval whatsoever, just waiting to find out what a body with no head is like. But the show lasts only seconds. They know this. Think about second chances, about past lives, parallel worlds, the beyond. And meanwhile, all the great ideologies can fit into a refrigerator. That's why a poem isn't a poem if it doesn't know how to suspend death. That's why the axe never makes it to the neck, but it's there at the point of dismembering it. Young poet from Peru, second place. Suppose you wrote 3 books and that your eyes had different filters in spite of the great armchair education you'd received at home. Suppose you were admitted to medicine. Suppose that when you saw a dead member, you got an erection you couldn't explain. Suppose no one read your books, your 3 books. So you wrote one final book and tore out the pages like daisy petals so they'd get lost in the hands of the poetry workers. You were their trade unionist. You were them. Suppose you never earned a degree in medicine and the pain of not being able to heal wrecked you. Suppose you handed over your burden on the train tracks. Suppose they scraped you up with a spatula, and even now they can't find all the parts of your body or all your poems. So there's a tradition at the ALTA conference, which is our bilingual reading series. It's very well loved, and typically translators will read a little of the original language and then read their English translation. So in the spirit of our bilingual readings, I wanted to share one poem in Spanish from this book and then my translation of it. So this is Circuncisión. Eso de jugar a los carritos chocones es un patrón no solo en los hombres sin visa, sino también en los países que acabaron de recuperar su independencia. Los contadores piensan en un documento que los legisle. Entonces exigen que los poetas redacten el mito. El partido sonríe. El pueblo corre despavorido por las calles estrechas, como los toros en las fiestas. Todos están en la plaza, llenos de sudor y de confianza en sí mismos. En las butacas, miles de fanáticos sienten placer de armar las primeras oposiciones. Nadie ha muerto todavía. Los fantasmas no alcanzan la mayoría de edad. Circumcision. That thing about playing bumper cars not only applies to men without visas, but also to countries that have just regained their independence. The accountants draw up a document to legislate them, then demand the poets draft the myth. The party smiles. People run horror-struck through the narrow streets like bulls during the festivals. Everyone's in the plaza, covered in sweat and self-confidence. In their theater seats, thousands of fanatics have the pleasure of mounting the first opposition. No one has died yet. Ghosts don't reach manhood. Thank you.
Wonderful. Our last reader has the distinction of traveling the farthest to be here, arriving from Boston this weekend and spending a little bit of time in Tucson. Ellen Elias-Bursac translates fiction and nonfiction from the Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian. Her translation from the Serbian of David Albohari's novel Gotzenmeyer was given ALTA's National Translation Award in 2006. She's currently the president of the American Literary Translators Association, and it's a thrill to have her in Tucson. Thanks so much, Ellen. Please come on up and read.
Wow, here we are. This is a sort of an emotional moment. We've been building the relationship between the University of Arizona and ALTA for a number of years, and really we're inaugurating our organization this evening as a sort of public presence in Tucson, and it's very exciting to do this with Kelsi, Vanada, and Lissy Jacquette, who are accomplished translators and also wonderful administrators, and I'm very pleased to be here. And I do want to say, what with the upcoming conference, that there will be, even if you don't end up attending the conference, registering and so forth, there will be some public events that are available to people who haven't registered. So keep your eyes on the various schedules that we publish. I'll be reading tonight from what are known as short stories, or you could think of them as prose poems. Either way, they work by an author named David Albahari, whose novel I translated that was given the National Translation Award. I've translated a lot of books by now, probably some 25, but I've done the most work of any writer. He's a Belgrade Jewish writer, a Serbian writer from Belgrade. Most of the writers I translate are from Croatia, but I like his work so much that I have always gravitated towards it. And we've heard a lot of readings this evening from tortuous and agonizing situations, from fascism to various all over the world. We've been reading these things, And they're here in his writing too, but he just approaches them very differently. So, and he's very much a postmodern writer. He likes words, sentences, and you'll see that in these short pieces. They came out, several of them, in an online journal called Almost Island, which is published by a group of editors and writers in India. I guess India is almost an island. I'm not sure why that comes. Anyway, the first of these is A Writer Without Words. A writer one day discovers he's no longer capable of writing. No matter what he tries, what path he follows, he cannot find his way to a full sentence. At first, the writer refuses to succumb and tries again and again to pull together at least one viable sentence, but the words resist. They refuse to obey. They respond not at all to his anxious calls. So the writer gradually gives in, throws up his hands, feigns disinterest, hoping the words will be duped into tiptoeing back to see what's up with him, why he's not around. But words are sly. Words have been through the mill, and the last thing they're willing to do is relinquish their newly won freedom. While they romp about and fling exclamation points, the writer considers becoming a mime. But the mimes don't welcome him in. They find mute poets disturbing. So the writer has no choice but to find work at a zoo. There he is, feeding the penguins. Okay, this one is a challenge to pull off. But when, while slicing oranges for a fruit salad on Tuesday evening at 6 o'clock in Zemun, Miomirka Yankovic cut herself, nicking the tip of her index finger with the point of the knife, and then moaned aloud and then stared at the crimson drop of blood, never could she have known that at that very moment on the other side of the world, in Buenos Aires, where the afternoon of that Sunday was only beginning, Vilma Mészáros, who had recently arrived there from Hungary, pricked her finger with the needle while sewing a button onto a lace blouse, then moaned aloud and then stared at the crimson drop of blood, thinking she had never seen anything so beautiful, without knowing that Miomirka Yankovic had the same thought as she rummaged through the kitchen table drawer for a Band-Aid, while Vilma Mészáros, younger and more adept, had already, though unnecessarily, wrapped one around her finger. One sentence. The third one is Calypso Rhythm. All of us rose to our feet, anticipating the national anthem. But the orchestra struck up a calypso. And they weren't just playing, they were dancing. The entire orchestra, conductor included, danced the calypso in unison, and quickly the rhythm moved over to us, crept up our arms and legs, nested in our bellies and behinds. Then we were joined by the honor guard, diplomats from the bleachers, children with flowers, even a crew from off a plane that had just landed. And then the presidents began to prance, first ours, then theirs, then together, holding hands, and then the TV cameramen started swaying without letting go of their cameras, so the picture on TV screens all over the country shimmied and shook. But no one complained, no one called in, not then or later, even much later, when the members of the orchestra claimed none of it ever happened. And the last one, I'll start with the Serbian, and it's short, and then go on to the English. Dolazak čutanja. Branio se prvo rečima. Posle je odbranu zasnovao na tišini. Čutao je I odbijao da se oglasi. Na kraju je pokušao da piše o tome I napisao je celu knjigu, ali nikomu nije verovao da je sve to sam uradio. Ponovo je morao da se brani rečima, ali sad je s nestrpljenjem očekivao dolazak čutanja, jer se radovao trenutku kad će ponovo početi da piše knjigu. The arrival of silence. He first defended himself with words. Later, his defense was steeped in silence. He was silent and refused to make a sound. In the end, he tried to write about this and wrote a whole book, but nobody believed he'd done it all himself. Again, he had to defend himself with words, but now he waited impatiently for the silence to come because he looked forward to the moment when he'd again begin to write a book.
Another round of applause for all of these translators. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I wanted to say two things as we exit. Thank you to all of you for coming. It means so much to see people back in this space, so we appreciate it enormously. If you want to learn more about the conferences with ALTA, we've mentioned the name multiple times, and the website is literarytranslators.org. Translators, plural, translators, right? Because there's many of them. Translators.org, literarytranslators.org. So you can go and find all the schedule for all the activities. And again, the next program that'll be happening with the Poetry Center is with Elisabeth, and that will be on the 14th of October, and that information is on the Poetry Center's website. Thanks again for being here. It's a real pleasure and wonderful to see people. Thanks for all the wonderful readings. Have a great night.